Hello, and welcome to this podcast on ASU 2012-02 for the impairment testing of indefinite-lived intangible assets, which allows entities to make a qualitative assessment when performing their impairment test. My name is Kevin Slama, and I'm a Senior Manager in KPMG's Department of Professional Practice. I'll be providing an overview of the guidance in the new ASU, discussing a potential process to perform the qualitative assessment, and addressing some of the factors to consider in performing the qualitative assessment. The qualitative assessment option for indefinite-lived intangible assets is a follow-up to ASU 2011-08 on testing goodwill for impairment. In the development of that ASU, many commentators suggested that a qualitative assessment would also be appropriate for indefinite-lived intangible assets due to the similarities in the factors affecting their fair value from period to period. The result was the issuance of ASU 2012-02 on July 27, 2012, permitting entities to make a qualitative assessment when evaluating indefinite-lived intangible assets for impairment. One of the main objectives of the ASU is to reduce the cost for both public and non-public entities in performing their required annual impairment assessment for indefinite-lived intangible assets. This is achieved by allowing management to first perform a qualitative assessment to determine whether it is more likely than not that an intangible asset is impaired, which exists when the carrying amount of the asset exceeds its fair value. Companies would only be required to perform a quantitative fair value calculation for the impairment test when it's more likely than not that it's impaired. In other words, the quantitative fair value calculation would only be required when it's more than 50% likely that the asset is impaired. The qualitative assessment is optional and exists on an asset-by-asset basis. So an entity may choose to apply the qualitative assessment for all of their indefinite-lived intangible assets, some of them, or none of them in any period. Additionally, it can elect each period whether or not it wants to perform a qualitative assessment. There are no specific requirements in the ASU on exactly how to do the qualitative assessment, other than that management needs to consider all of the relative facts and circumstances that could impact the fair value of the intangible asset. The extent and effort needed to support a conclusion based on the qualitative assessment will depend on the specific facts and circumstances. In some cases, that conclusion may be very clear with relatively little effort when all relevant factors are trending positively, but in other cases, when the conclusion becomes less clear, additional effort and documentation may be necessary, or management may determine that it needs to bypass the qualitative assessment and go straight to the quantitative analysis. Although there are no specific requirements or steps outlined in the ASU to perform the qualitative assessment, it's clear management will need to have some process in place to support its conclusions regarding potential impairment, since management is required to make a determination on at least an annual basis whether or not indefinite-lived intangible assets are impaired. Additionally, having a clearly defined process in place may help to make the analysis as efficient as possible for both the initial adoption of the new standard and in applying the standard on an ongoing basis. We've developed one example of a potential process for consideration that I'll walk you through that could be applied by an entity in the assessment. The example consists of 7 steps, and again, this is just for illustrative purposes to think through. It's not a requirement of the standard, nor are we saying that management has to apply the 7 steps in the way that I described them. Step 1 is to consider for which indefinite-lived intangible assets to perform a qualitative assessment and which to proceed directly to a quantitative impairment test. For example, in-process research and development, or IPR&D for short, is within the scope of this ASU,